Me chiamo Berta e nasciu en Jaca. Vivo en Ansó. Tengo una hermana y 4 hermanos. O mío marido é inglés. Tengo 2 fillas.
Nestled high in the western valleys of the Spanish Pyrenees, only an hour from the French border, the small medieval village of Ansó stands in stark contrast to most of modern Spain. Ansó's cobblestone streets, lined with traditional houses, offer one of the best preserved and most beautiful examples of Pyrenean architecture in Aragon. I first learned of this mountain community of 400 people thanks to a personal connection, my Aunt Berta, an Ansotana born and raised. One of my lasting memories of visiting the area when I was much younger was going to see my uncle act in a show with others from the village. I'll always remember this quirky little play about a cow called Jessica, partly for its outlandish costumes, but mainly because it was written entirely in the local dialect. That dialect, Ansotano, branches off from Aragonese, a family of rural dialects scattered around the high valleys of the Pyrenees and their surrounding foothills. The use of Aragonese dialects has fluctuated throughout history, following countless power struggles and social upheavals over the centuries. Aragonese peaked the best part of 1,000 years ago, right before the emergence of the Castilian dynasty in the 15th century, which gave us the standard official language of 21st century Spain. As a result, Ansotano has fallen out of use. Along with the near extinction of Ansotano as a language, its colourful history of music and dance is fading too.
Life in Ansó is very quiet, especially in the summer. Sometimes it's hard if you don't come from the village. It's very hard because people are very introverted. But it has changed quite a lot. Ansó is one of these villages that we call in Spanish La España vaciada, which means the empty Spain. All the politics or all the governments are centered in the cities and left the rural areas without care at all. A certain time they have to leave to carry on studying, and most of the youngsters they don't come back.
Rural emigration has been a constant theme that everyone's left. Pretty much everyone's left and went to the towns to work in the factories in the 50s and 60s and things like that. Life's a lot easier, there you could have a house, hot and cold running water, a steady job, raise your kids, they could go to university, all of that kind of thing.
Ansotano is the local language in the village. Being so isolated made a special place, and we developed a language that is only spoken in this village. And the next village is another language, very similar, connected but with different features. I used to speak Ansotano with my grandparents and with my dad, and since they died, I stopped speaking Ansotano. Sometimes I have some words that I believe that are Spanish, but they are not. They are pure Ansotano, but it's just nouns and adjectives, basically.
Entraba dentro del mundo femenino, entonces el mundo de las mujeres, el mundo de los hombres estaba muy separado. Es decir, mi hermano se iba a la calle a jugar al fútbol, pero yo me quedaba con las mujeres. Y estas mujeres contaban historias de la vida. Esas historias de la vida no entraban dentro de los cánones que se escuchaban fuera. Es decir, estaban hablando de historias de hombres que se jugaban el ganado y volvían al pueblo pobres, de mujeres que se quedaban embarazadas fuera del matrimonio y daban al niño a la inclusa. Contaban historias de mujeres que cruzaban andando el puerto para ir a trabajar a Francia. Todas esas historias, si tengo que cavilarlas, las pienso en Ansotano.
The geography of the Pyrenees is obviously going to be a factor, especially historically. the kind of conventional way of thinking about these languages is kind of that they're these traditional dialects, that they've been preserved in these isolated rural areas, and people historically haven't been particularly mobile, and so that, you know, they preserve these archaisms and things.
Maybe 100 years ago, 200, you look at a Spanish dictionary from 200 years ago and the language looks like, the words look like the dialect words here. For an example, there's a word that describes what's left when a sheep dies, when the wool is all just kind of left on the ground. You know, it's just all there is the wool on the ground. And there's a precise word for that because they needed to have that description, for example. You know, all this sort of weird stuff. And you look at the old dictionaries and there's words that describe things that we don't even think about anymore.
You can get wild figures from nobody speaks it any longer to a handful of people speaks it to, you know, oh, there are 500 people who could speak it. All these languages have been declared dead for every single year, every single decade. They're declared dead and they continue. So we may be having this conversation in 100 years' time. Certainly what you can say is that in comparison to a quite robust minoritized language like, say, Catalan or Galician, we're clearly talking about much, much lower figures. And I don't like to use the terms, you know, is disappearing, but effectively that's where they find themselves.
Of course, with media, literacy, TV, radio, Franco, so on and so forth, everything's become standardized, the same as it has in Britain, really, or anywhere. People then move out of those regions for economic reasons, and they move to urban areas where there's a different language, and for, you know, socio-linguistic reasons, they may not wish to or be stigmatized against for speaking their, you know, those local variants. And so the more political and economic clout that you have, the more likely it is that your language is going to predominate in society, right? So the flip side goes, if you're a little village in an isolated rural region, is you're not going to have as much resources to kind of quote unquote, you know, preserve.
We can see this form of political and cultural domination in full force throughout Spain in the mid-20th century.
Un Estado totalitario armonizará en España el funcionamiento de todas las capacidades y energías del país, en el que dentro de la unidad nacional el trabajo, estimado como el más ineludible de los deberes, será el único exponente de la voluntad popular.
Outside of Spain, Francisco Franco is often regarded alongside Hitler and Mussolini as one of Europe's most reviled fascist leaders. A brutal dictator who led his country into civil war and went on to preside over the death, torture, and exile of hundreds of thousands of his opponents. In some Spanish towns and villages, Franco is honoured in the form of streets, plazas, and even statues, though much of Spain has now severed its commitment to the Pact of Forgetting the Past and are coming to terms with the decades of repression that followed the Civil War. General Franco's plan while in power was for the whole of Spain to have and to promote a singular national identity, and in so doing, repress Spain's cultural diversity. Bullfighting and flamenco were promoted as national traditions, while those traditions not considered Spanish were suppressed. All cultural activities were subject to censorship, and many were forbidden entirely.
When Franco banned the language, it was like for our parents that they lived all this period of time that they could not speak the dialect. There was a shame for them to speak, and it was like you have no culture at all if you speak this language, and they were punished if they did. But the grandparents they used the language at home.
Con una represión muy férrea desde la escuela ya general para todo el mundo, y era hablar el castellano. Y hay mucha gente de mis años que saben mucho mejor el ansotano que yo, pero no abre la boca y no dice una palabra en ansotano. ¿Hasta dónde llega una represión? No lo sé.
In Spain, not everywhere was impacted in the same way. as cultural repression relies on strict surveillance and complete adherence by enforcers. Even in the Echo Valley, just a 15-minute drive from Ansó, the situation was very different. Their similar yet distinct dialect Ceso fared much better than Ansotano, thanks primarily to just one person.
When Franco arrived and banished the language, the teachers were a very important part for not using the language. In Echo, they were lucky to have one of the teachers where she didn't punish the children. So she didn't promote, but she didn't punish, because all the children, when they went to school, they spoke the same that at home. There are not many songs recorded in Ansotano. There are some jotas. We are in Ansotano. It's very, very folk and very traditional sort of music. There are no groups that sing in Ansotano. It's a song called Chan de Mingorra. Chan de Mingorra. Chan is como casa. It's like a house.
El Chan de Mingorra sí me llegó. El Chan de Mingorra, mi abuela me habló de la Aracay, pero no lo bailó. Sí bailó el Chan de Mingorra. El Chan de Mingorra, por tradición oral de mi abuela, me decía que se bailaba ese día que se subía en romería y que se hacía una cruz de piedras en el suelo y había que bailarlo tan rápido, muy rápido. Chan de Mingorra no mi amigo ticotaco los churruquí, para no pisar las piedras. Si eso lo hacías hábilmente, muy rápido, tenías derecho a un...
The ones that I know is religious, and sometimes they have these pre-Christian also connotations, like believing in spirits and witches.
Okay, we played some of the old melodies of, ancient, some of them, and there's a religious, like it's a hymn, a bit like the Song of Songs called the Alba of Embun, which is a song to the Virgin Mary, which is very Christian. Some are, environmental songs. There's one about Ornavo de Eito, which is about a giant turnip.
Está en la historia que aquí yo remato, porque Embun lo clama, lo clama, lo clama, lo clama. Oh lugar dos napos.
There was a song called the Alba de Biernesa, which is a beautiful song that's sung on both sides of the Pyrenees. It's sang on the French side too, and that that's about crossing the mountains and the fog. That the mountains are big, but our love is even bigger. And there's those kind of metaphors and things in some of the old songs. Definitely, local people here know the name of every field, every geographical feature, every rock, every pool in the river. Everything's got a name. Everything's important, and you hear people describing landscape to each other with complete precision with the names and things like that. That's all about survival as well. That's all about being able to, your sheep is in such and such a place, or we're going hunting there, or tomorrow morning I'm going to be in this place, and you know exactly where they're talking about.
In the Pyrenees, music and sheep shearing go hand in hand. There are records of songs that were sung before, during, and after the hard labour was done. To prepare for the day, the shepherds would gather and sing a repeating refrain while they each took a turn to drink wine from a goat skin. As they worked, they sang of a mythical man of tiny proportions who lived within the fleeces of their flock, reminding them to stay focused and to take care in their craft. Once the sheep were shorn, the revelries could begin, and the shepherds would return to feast and dance with the local women.
There's salterio, which is basically a four-string, a psaltery it would be called, which is basically a resonating box and four strings that you bang with a stick at the same time as you play a whistle called a chisto. You see medieval sculptures of people who are playing those. It's the oldest traditional instrument around, really. So there's that. There's the Aragonese pipes, which are kind of bagpipes. Again, they go back, way back. Then there's the guitar, which probably has been around for 150 years in this area, 200 years probably. Smaller guitar called the guitarrico, little guitar. Then there's a bandurria, which is like a mandolin, but with 12 strings. Extremely hard thing to play. You don't play chords, you only play notes on it and runs of notes and things like that. You've also got the dulzaina, which is like a kind of hillbilly oboe. Then there's, of course, the accordion is the big instrument here.
These instruments are not the only elements of Pyrenean culture that have either survived or been revived from the medieval era. Once a symbol of an authentic, traditional Spain, an idea popularised through paintings of its people and spaces in the late 19th century, Ansó and its neighbours remain bound to their past.
We have a special dress. It's very peculiar and very typical from this small village. The last Sunday in August, we celebrated the typical dress day, showing tradition, showing identity.
I've been fortunate enough to see the spectacle of the Dia del Traje firsthand, and witness the complete transformation of the town and its inhabitants. This is largely testament to the commitment and pride of the local community. Even Ansó's very youngest start the day by donning their medieval finery, and though their parents are clearly delighted by the sight, the fidgeting and tantrums tell a different story. Around noon, Ansó's mayor will introduce a parade of traditional costumes around the main square, then through the town streets, which act as a cobblestone catwalk. Later, after mass and a long lunch, the real party can begin, the jota. Dating back as far as the 18th century, the Aragonese jota is a courtship dance accompanied by folk music in 3/4 or 3/8 timing. As we'll see though, it isn't the only folk dance in Ansó, and it certainly isn't the oldest.
Nowadays, we have the jota, which jota is like the popular music all around Spain. And in Ansó, before the jota, there was some other music and dances, like the one is called alacai. This alacai dance has been lost in the 19th century, I think. But there's a picture. Sorolla was a Spanish painter from Valencia, and he came to our village and saw this a dance, that's very peculiar dance with some handkerchiefs, and he painted a picture. It was a music that normally is connected with religion and with relationship between women and men.
La lacaya ha quedado en la memoria colectiva como un baile que se hacía ritual, que se hacía cuando se subía en romería a la Virgen de Julieta. Es un baile de aceptación. Los cofrades, las dos personas mayores de reconocido prestigio que ese año son los hermanos mayores de esa fiesta, mi marido y su mujer, cofrade y su mujer, inician la danza. Y esa danza la inician los jóvenes y en un momento dado pasan por debajo de los pañuelos que ponen el mayordomo, es decir, el hombre, el mayordomo, y su mujer, la mayordoma, y ellos levantan el pañuelo y ellos pasan por debajo del pañuelo, los aceptan como personas en esa sociedad de adultos y de gente honrada y buena, tal como se hace ahora, tal como se ha recuperado. A mí me parece que es un baile, que es un vals suave, cuando era un baile de aceptación, pero es lógico, es decir, el poder ritual que tenían ciertas ceremonias en la cultura tradicional no se puede mantener hoy, no se puede hacer, pasa a ser un baile de escenario, si quieres, o un baile folclórico, pero ha perdido toda su carga ritual.
The kind of revival and the maintenance of these linguistic traditions goes hand in hand with these musical cultural traditions and associations. So you can't really think of one without the other. You often have these movements that are often quite urban based, where they're revival of local variants. And so, and those people won't necessarily have grown up speaking those languages, but maybe have, become interested in their heritage later in life as an adult and start wanting to reclaim that part of their history of themselves. And linguistically, they then end up being different because those people have different linguistic experiences. So you often have these kind of, I don't know, it's too simplistic to say like these two parallel ones, the traditional one and the new one. But you do have, to a certain extent, then like another layer of complexity where you have these clashes between old and new. Then you have sometimes quite often these tensions of, which is the real Ansotano, which is the real Aragonese. And I mean, I wouldn't say that those arguments are missing the point, but there is sometimes then these further tensions can then contribute to making the situation even more tricky when it comes to people who, want to preserve those languages, because there's no agreement on what counts as the language and therefore what should be maintained. People often say, I'll often look at it from the other way around, or like, how are they, what's happened to make them die out? But the real question is, well, what happened that they survived these years of oppression, and the fact that these languages are still spoken at all is in some ways a little bit of a miracle.
El ansotano es milagroso que haya sobrevivido desde que llegaron a la corona de Aragón los reyes de Castilla en la dinastía de los Trastámaras. Y es milagroso que haya sobrevivido.
We don't know what is lost because we don't know. We know that if we keep speaking and promoting the language, we may discover more about our history and like musical traditions that they have lost.
You've lost really the verbal expression of a culture that's disappearing, really, so you've had a rural culture that's existed for 1,000 years or more, really, that's disappeared, and that culture's disappearing as the language disappears. One goes with the other.
Y yo vengo de una cultura que tiene mucha experiencia detrás, que tiene mucha sabiduría, que tiene mucha historia, y a mí personalmente me gustaría conservarlo. Siempre que se pierde una lengua, se pierde una parte de cultura muy importante, muy triste.
Languages can carry so many different meanings for people, and it's that connection to a heritage. I'm not a person who sees language as an expression of culture from an academic point of view, but I guess language loss is emblematic of broader types of power struggles, essentially. And when a language is lost, what does it mean? Well, it means that group has undergone some sort of oppression that has meant that, in this case, linguistic expression they've not been able to maintain that for whatever reason, and usually it's because of an external political pressure or an external economic pressure or whatever, or worse. What is lost? That I guess.
At every step of our journey in understanding Ansotano, we have discovered how language is so much more than just words on a page. Ansotano's remaining speakers are conduits of the language's much broader history, its roots in nature, and its connections with culture. But that relationship is fragile, and as we've seen, a repressive regime and a lingering cultural shame have factored into the decline of Ansotano and other dialects like it. There is hope to be had for its survival, though. With a renewed interest in cultural and linguistic revival, some schools in Aragon are teaching classes in their local dialects.
¿Nos puedes decir algunos nombres de animales?
Por ejemplo, perro es can. Can o cocho, también hay zonas que le llaman cocho, más coloquialmente, pero el nombre es can.
¿Y el gato?
El gato misin, le dicen en muchos sitios.
While these classes will not guarantee its future, it will certainly lead to more introspection and the awakening of bygone traditions like the Alakai. It is through music and through memory that Ansotano has survived the centuries, and it is through music and through memory that it will persist.